Cheers to 3.3 point cellular energy. Note disclaimer. Photo!
Energy is needed to grow. Now I can grow and run smoothly.
And that's how we keep homeostasis, everything balanced, everything just right.
Let's reproduce. Energy keeps us going.
When we're talking about energy in Unit 3, we're going to focus on how energy is utilized when it comes to biology. And this is a really important concept to understand because Unit 3 is building upon previous concepts that you've learned in Unit 1 and Unit 2. You're going to continue to utilize the term energy in future units as well. But the reason why this is important is because if you get an AP biology exam later on down the line, there is a tendency to focus on the bigger picture rather than the nitty-gritty. So what do I mean by that? If you remember in Unit 1, we talked about the different macromolecules, such as this idea that we're building macromolecules based on the building blocks. And we talked about the 4 macromolecules. Well, those processes involve some sort of energy to either build up or break down those molecules. Another thing is in Unit 2, we talked about moving molecules across the plasma membrane. And if you remember, we talked about ATP and active transport, how active transport requires some energy or ATP to move across that membrane. Now, later in Unit 3, we're going to be talking about the process of cellular respiration and photosynthesis. We're going to be comparing and contrasting the energy usage or the energy loss. Simple processes such as muscle contraction and creating new cells require some sort of energy. Essentially, growth, cells running smoothly, homeostasis, and reproduction all require some sort of energy. Let's get more into detail. So you might have heard of this term metabolism. And usually if you are really into fitness, you'll notice they utilize the word metabolism like, oh, I have a high metabolism. And what they're really saying is they're totaling the chemical processes that exist within you. Basically, how much you're exercising versus caloric intake, what foods you're getting in. So energy is stored in these molecules, usually in foods that we eat. And the goal of metabolism is to manage these materials and energy sources. So oftentimes there's a series of small controlled steps. And rather than having a one-size-fits-all energy release, we have different pathways called metabolic pathways that help really regulate these processes. And an example of this is in catabolic processes, we're breaking down complex molecules. An example of this is in the mitochondria. The mitochondria basically goes through what's cellular respiration. Remember, we as human beings consume our food, and that food has energy that needs to be broken down. And that's where ATP comes in. That is going into the mitochondria to then break down. Another opposite process is photosynthesis. Remember, we have the sun's energy that needs to be harnessed, and that happens in, say, the chloroplast. That process of photosynthesis also lets go of some sort of ATP that we then utilize. These processes altogether revolve around better control, efficient transfer, and easy regulation between all 3 energy steps. And so that's why energy is very important for us to understand. The regulation is really important. Now, when we talk about energy, we're talking about the ability to do matter or the ability ability to rearrange matter, I want to say. And you're going to be talking about the differences between heterotrophs like animals, where basically we don't just sit out in the sun and harness energy. What ends up happening is we consume our energy by either other organisms, or if you think about it, we can eat meats or we can eat plants, and that's where we get our energy, and therefore we're called heterotrophs. In opposite, there are things like plants that are called autotrophs, and they lay out and capture the sun's energy via photosynthesis. Now, there are three main forms of energy: kinetic, potential, and activation energy. We talked about activation energy, which is the requirement to go from potential to kinetic when we were talking about enzymes. And if you remember, we had a little chart and we said we had to go from reactant to product. And the action of going from reactant to product required some sort of activation energy. That's where activation energy comes in. You're converting that potential energy in that molecule to then become kinetic. Potential energy is the stored energy, the energy sort of equivalent to if you're getting ready to dive off of a board. And kinetic energy is the active motion. You want to think about a diver actually diving and moving. That would be the activation energy being utilized into kinetic energy. So to recap, we have energy, which is the ability to do work, and all living systems depend on that energy. We as humans are heterotrophs. We get energy by consuming other organisms, such as plants. Plants are a little bit different because they're called autotrophs, and they capture the light, and that light is utilized as energy in a process called photosynthesis. Energy in general can be divided into three different forms: kinetic, which is the active motion; potential, which is stored energy. So kinetic would be the individual actually diving. Potential would be the person getting ready to dive. And activation energy is the conversion of potential to kinetic, usually associated with enzymes where we're having reactants go to some product. Now that we have that all set in stone, let's talk about the law of thermodynamics. So for cells, remember there are some sort of new information that you potentially don't know. So when we're talking about thermodynamics, we usually think about physics, but for the purposes of cells, when we need to remain functional and organized, we need to absorb the energy more than they can expend. And that is where the law of thermodynamics comes in. In the first law, we basically say energy can be transferred, but not created or destroyed. Think about, for example, us as human beings. We consume our food from food sources such as plants. And those plants did not just have that energy, they came to receive that energy from the light. So energy is just being utilized, and then we will release energy. For example, we will let go of certain foods, and then that could be reused, that energy for to be harnessed for plants. So these are all different ways where energy is not created nor destroyed, but just transferred. The second law of thermodynamics basically states that every energy transfer increases the universe's entropy, which just means chaos. So I want you to think of every time you have some sort of reaction, you are transferring that energy. And that energy transfer is going to require some sort of chaos. Think about for a second when you had the enzyme and you had the substrate attaching together. That process requires the activation energy. The process of them joined together will increase the chaos because eventually something needs to occur. That enzyme will attach to the active site, therefore lowering that activation energy. That is a form of chaos, essentially. And so that's important to note as well. Going back to the law of thermodynamics, I want you to also understand free energy. So When you're talking about free energy, you're talking about the ability to do work. For example, you have this formula called the Gibbs free energy, and it's just going to help you understand what we mean by energy. The portion of the energy that can do work is symbolized with this formula, which basically means that we have free energy, which is the total enthalpy or energy of the system, and then minus the temperature and the chaos. So if you look down below, you will see two reactions here. And you'll see here, it looks very similar to what we spoke about with enzymes. And with exergonic reactions, we have these reactants which are high in energy. And to get to the products, they go low in energy, which means that, remember, energy cannot be created nor destroyed. It has to go somewhere. So what happens is they lose some of that energy out. And that's why we call it exergonic or loss of energy. Endergonic is a little bit different. That's when energy goes in. For example, we have reactants and they go to products. Well, you can see that the products have more energy. Energy went into the reaction. So examples of this endergonic or energy going in include processes like photosynthesis. So exergonic, when we release energy, would be something like cellular respiration. Ways you can think about it is that when you're running, you're releasing energy, and that is exergonic. That is going to require you to breathe a lot more. And so that's cellular respiration. Plants sit still, and because they sit still, they have to absorb the sun's energy. So that would be an example of endergonic. Now we are talking about enzymes and we're going into Unit 3, and now we're in Section 3.3. Some factors to just remind yourself. Remember, we talked about in the previous section, we have several factors that influence enzymes. Well, there are some things that could help that reactant go to that product. Remember, we spoke about cofactors, which are inorganic helpers, or coenzymes, which are organic helpers. We spoke about competitive versus non-competitive inhibitors. All of these require some sort of energy, and the act of an enzyme being utilized means that there's energy that was required to go from reactant to product.
No oxygen, no problem. Glycolysis runs off pure hustle. 2 ATP in, 4 ATP out, a quick grab for cash before the real work begins.
Meanwhile, deep inside the mitochondria, the electron transport chain turns chaos into current.
When we talk about organisms, we notice that they have similar energy processes, and this allows us to deduce that there could be evidence for a common ancestor. This falls in line with a later unit, but for now, just note that energy is really important, and the way that energy is utilized in biological functions is really important because it shows that we have similar patterns. For example, if we look at the organisms, they have shared patterns, and for a lot of these processes, they stayed very similar for a very long time. And what happened is that a lot of these processes to generate energy are very complex. And that leads us to believe that they were inherited because these processes were very similar, especially in their complexity. Let's talk about the process of glycolysis. Please note you'll get a more detailed breakdown as this is the first step in cellular respiration, and there is a whole section dedicated to this. But I just want you to think of Unit 1 when we talked about macromolecules and we said about carbohydrates and how there is something known as glucose or sugar. The goal of glycolysis or glycolysis is to, if you remember the word lysis is breakdown, we have a molecule of glucose, and glycolysis is the process of breaking down that glucose. And the thing is, this occurs in a majority of cells, and this process is very complex but very similar in all cells. And it requires some sort of ATP, which we're going to talk about in just a second. The process of electron transport chain, which happens later on after glycolysis occurs, is also very complex as well and involves creating ATP. It's also part of cellular respiration found in the mitochondria, and it utilizes something called chemiosmosis, which is a pump that is in that plasma, not in the plasma membrane, but in the membrane associated with the mitochondria, and it creates a lot of ATP. To get into more details about this, we're going to compare and contrast glycolysis versus oxidative phosphorylation. Both of these processes are key components when we talk about the process of creating ATP. So, when we're talking about creating ATP, you're thinking about cellular respiration. Once again, just note we're going to go into more details into this in cellular respiration. But the point is this is a very complex process, as we said before, where we're taking that glucose and we're producing some sort of ATP in the long run. And with glycolysis, there's some utilization of ATP or energy, and it's used to convert in this long process, eventually leading to 4-ATP and 2-NADH in the product of the reaction, because that is what comes about from splitting the glucose. Essentially, at some point, we also have this process called oxidative phosphorylation, which consists of two separate parts. The first part is the electron transport chain, and the second part is the chemiosmosis and ATP synthesis. What happens in glycolysis is eventually down the line, it'll go through a process called the oxidative phosphorylation. And what happens is the NADH and the ATP and all that that's being produced comes along from the two previous processes before it occurs in oxidative phosphorylation. Let me recap. So in ETC, or electron transport chain, we have some electrons from NADH and FADH that are produced in the first two processes in cellular respiration, and that's known as glycolysis and the citric acid cycles. Sometimes you'll see the Krebs cycle. And the goal to remember now is this is a very convoluted process that occurs in the mitochondrial matrix. So in the mitochondrial matrix, which is, if you remember, the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, it's one of those key organelles that's really important. And that's because it's creating this electrochemical gradient along that. It's very similar to the plasma membrane where you have a phospholipid bilayer and it's embedded with these proteins, and that creates the electrochemical gradient. And if you remember when we talk about membrane transport, sometimes we utilize these proteins to help assist in moving along different items. And this is important to recognize because what happens is this gradient drives what's called the ATP synthase, which is the process of production of ATP. So chemiosmosis and ATP synthase after the electron transport chain allows us to produce a lot of ATPs. In fact, 34, sometimes 36 in textbooks. So you want to understand some things when we're talking about glycolysis and oxidative phosphorylation. These are very complex processes, but the goal is actually very simple. It's to produce a lot of ATP. And we're going to talk more about the middle step, which is the citric acid cycle, when we talk about the process of cellular respiration. But for now, the goal of the brief overview between these two processes is to understand that there is production of ATP, which is important when it comes to understanding where energy comes from. It's not created nor destroyed, it's just being transferred over. And this is a clear process involving that. Now let's try a quiz question. Take a moment and read this question. Okay, so in this question it says during intense exercise, muscle cells rapidly convert ADP back to ATP to meet energy demands. Which of the following best explains the process and its relationship to cellular metabolism? Did you select the answer? The answer would be B. Let's compare why. When we talk about answer choice A, it says the conversion of ADP to ATP is an example of catabolism because it involves the breakdown of molecules to release. Catabolism, if you remember from the previous slide here, is going to be cellular respiration. And cellular respiration, as we learn later on, is the production of ATP. So while we're talking about ATP production, we're not breaking down molecules to release energy, would not be this specific process. We're not converting ADP to ATP. Instead, what we're doing is, remember, we talked about that last step, which is ATP synthase from ADP, adenosine diphosphate, which is two phosphates converting into three. This is processed by a catabolic pathway, yes, but it utilizes glycolysis and citric acid cycle. So this is a response that's better than answer choice A because while it's a process of catabolism and it involves some sort of processes, we need to know specifically what those processes are because we're talking about intense exercise which revolves around cellular respiration. We're not talking about ADP to ATP in muscle cells, do not require an external energy source. And so because of that, remember where energy is neither created nor destroyed. So C would not be the best choice. And ATP synthesis only occurs in the mitochondria, means that we are negating, we don't like the word only because it's too extreme of an answer choice. So in this case, B is the best choice for the option. Yes, A is a good answer, but B is a better answer based on the information that we know about the process of cellular respiration and its intensity. When we breathe more, we exercise more, and therefore we're going to use processes like glycolysis, Krebs cycle, or citric acid cycle, and the electron transfer chain to eventually produce ATP. Specifically when we're talking about the process of the electron transfer chain and how there's ATP production. Now, this is more complex of a question in this section, but you're going to understand more in 3.4, 3.5, etc. So hopefully that helps understand the knowledge that you need for this unit.
Appreciate you riding along for our cosmic journey. If today's mission brought you the knowledge that slaps, make sure to hit that like button to boost that signal. Subscribe if you're locked in for our next launch. And don't miss the link tree. It's got all the goods for AP Bio, PSAT Math, and SAT Math. Before I sign out, make sure you're all in one orbit and diving in. Killing out. Till next time.